Welcome everyone to the fiscal year 19 funding outlook for affordable housing program. Today's webinar is going to start in a little bit, but before we do, I just want to remind everyone in the call that this webinar will be recorded and available on the National Low Income Housing Coalition's website under webinar events. Additionally, if you would like to ask any questions, please use the chat or question box that's available on the right-hand side of your screen. I'm going to now turn it over to Sonia, who will be beginning the webinar.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. This is Sonia Costa with the National Low Income Housing Coalition, filling in for Elaine. Thank you so much for joining our webinar on the budget outlook for affordable housing programs in fiscal year 2019. This webinar is being hosted by the Campaign for Housing and Community Development Funding, or as we call it, CHCDF. CHCDF is an education strategy and action hub that includes more than 70 national organizations working to ensure the highest allocation of resources possible to support affordable housing and community development. CHCDF members represent a full continuum of national housing and community development organizations. As a coalition, we meet with decision makers to promote the importance of federal funding for affordable housing and community development programs. We have a lot to talk about today, so we're going to go ahead and jump in and look at the agenda. First, we have Doug Rice from Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, then Ellen Lori Hoffman from the National Housing Trust, Tess Hembry from National Association of Housing and Redevelopment Officials, Steve Berg from National Alliance to End Homelessness, and finally, Joe Lindstrom from the National Low Income Housing Coalition. So first, we're just going to do a brief budget overview, then get into some of the more specifics of the different housing programs before finishing up with different opportunities for advocacy. All right, and I'm going to turn it over to Doug Rice from Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. Doug?
Well, hi, everyone, and thanks again for joining us. Next slide, please. So I'm going to start with a very broad brush overview. As you know, fiscal year 2019 starts on October 1st, and I'm going to start by explaining exactly where we are in the process of determining what the budget for HUD programs and other federal agencies as well, where we are in that process. So first, a little bit of background. As many of you have no doubt heard, the year really began with an agreement under the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2018. Under this agreement, Congress and the administration increased the spending caps for discretionary programs. As many of you know, the federal government has been operating under very stringent budget caps since 2011, and there was this agreement on February 9th to raise those caps, and there's two separate caps. There's one for defense programs and one for the category of non-defense discretionary programs. That second category is the category that includes most HUD accounts. To raise those caps for fiscal years 2018 and 2019. And this action made more resources available in these 2 years. And also, because there's an agreement on the overall level of funding in these two categories, it greatly facilitates the process of deciding budgets in these 2 years. And then not too long after that, the Trump administration introduced its own fiscal year 2019 budget request that pretty much ignored the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2018 agreement and proposed really deep funding cuts in a wide range of domestic programs, including really deep cuts in a range of HUD programs, as well as some policy changes that would sharply raise rents on HUD-assisted tenants. And then the House and Senate Appropriations Committees went to work, and They started work relatively early this year, partly because of this agreement on overall funding levels, and they've gotten pretty far along, at least relative to recent history. The appropriations committees in both chambers have each approved 12 separate funding bills for 2019. The House has passed 5 of their 12 bills, and the Senate has now passed 7 of its 12 bills, and in fact, it may pass a couple of more later this month. Next slide, please. So that's where we are, and I'm going to talk about some specifics with respect to HUD in a sec. But what's really the path forward from here on? Well, in order to finalize the 2019 budget for HUD and other agencies, the policymakers have to do a few things. One, they have to reach agreement on how to allocate funding among the 12 spending bills. So while each committee approved bills at funding levels that are consistent with the bipartisan budget agreement spending levels, they made very different choices with respect to how to divide those funds up among federal agencies and federal programs. And so before they can really negotiate final agreements on specific bills, such as the Transportation HUD funding bill, they have to reach an overall agreement on how to allocate the overall funding among the 12 bills. And then once they have that allocation agreement, then they can go to work negotiating specific bills, such as the Transportation HUD funding bill. And then, of course, the president has to sign the final products into law. At each of these steps along the way, there are challenges that have the potential to delay or obstruct progress in completing the budget. Although, as I said, the fact that they're working from an agreement on what overall spending levels are certainly helps a lot. So what are some of these challenges? Well, one is there have been still fairly significant disagreements about the allocations among the 12 bills, and to a small extent you see this just in the Transportation HUD bill. There's about an $800 million difference with respect to funding for HUD programs. The Senate Transportation HUD bill provides $800 million more for HUD programs than the House bill, but there are even larger disagreements with respect to some of the other areas of the federal budget. There are also potentially disagreements about what we call so-called policy riders. So these are not so much about funding levels, but about changes in policies that can be attached to appropriations bills as they move through. And in some areas, such as healthcare or environmental policy, and some others as well, immigration, these can be very controversial and make it difficult to move bills through. And finally, of course, is the president, who has been something of a wild card, to say the least. In fact, he's via Twitter already threatened a shutdown this year if Congress doesn't meet his demands for border wall funding in the appropriations bill that comes to his desk. And so that creates some uncertainty about how this might play out as well. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, well, what about the HUD budget in specific and some of these other agency budgets? How does it look going forward on a timeline? Well, as most of you know, the House has already left for August recess. They won't be returning until after Labor Day, and they will likely remain in town for only 2 or 3 weeks in September, and then disappear again to go home to campaign for November elections. The Senate is currently in recess, but they're coming back next week, and we'll be back for at least 2 weeks and maybe 3 weeks of August to do some work, though, and that could include some appropriations work, but mostly confirmation work. And then they'll be back in September as well. So how could the appropriations process conceivably wrap up? Well, We think most likely what we'll see is that House and Senate will both return in September, and they will be forced to approve a temporary funding resolution, what we call a temporary or a continuing resolution, to carry funding for HUD and other federal agencies through the November elections. And then the goal there will be to come back to Washington after the elections in either late November or early December to approve final appropriations for fiscal year 2019. There's an alternative that's somewhat less likely. There has been talk that Congress, given how much success they've had at moving some bills through the chambers so far, that they would make an effort to try to finalize some small set of the 12 bills in September. Basically approve 3, 4, 5, or a package of 3, 4, 5 individual bills in September, finalize those, and then everything else would go on the continuing resolution until after the elections. If they go that route, it's conceivable that the HUD funding bill could be part of a small package that could be approved in September. But at the moment, for various reasons, we see this likelihood as being pretty low. Another alternative outcome here is that following the elections, when Congress returns in November to work on bills, that they just fail to reach agreement on a final funding bill for 2019 or package of funding bills for 2019. There could be any of a number of reasons for this. They may be political. They may fail to just really struggle to reach agreement on things like funding for a border wall along Mexico. And under that scenario, Congress would be forced to approve another continuing resolution that would basically kick the can down the road into early 2019, when they'd come back again after the holiday recess and try to wrap things up then. Okay, next slide, please. So that's kind of where we are with respect to the budget process and how things might proceed going forward. There's also a number of policy items on the legislative agenda that I just want to mention briefly as well, so they're on your radar. As you no doubt have heard from many sources, the Trump administration, as part of its fiscal year 2019 budget request, included a raft of proposed policy changes. It would make major changes in the way rents are determined in HUD rental assistance programs, as well as provide housing authorities and private owners with the option of imposing work requirements on assisted tenants. Just an update on those. That proposal to date has really received no traction in Congress, likely due to the fact that a lot of stakeholders at the national level, but also at the state and local level, have done great work highlighting the potential harmful impact of those proposals on low-income individuals and families. There's also a piece of legislation that shares some characteristics with the administration's rent policy proposals. This is a bill called the Promoting Resident Opportunity Through Rent Reform Act of 2018, which has been circulated in draft form by Congressman Ross from Florida. The House Financial Services Committee held a hearing on that bill towards the end of April. As I said, it shares some characteristics with the administration's proposal, but rather than requiring or authorizing HUD to direct or implement new rent rules for HUD programs from above, it would give housing authorities flexibility at the state and local level to impose new rent rules. And there's a whole menu of options, as well as a lot of flexibility for designing alternative rules as well. While this is a different approach to some extent, our own view is that it would have many of the same implications, likely lead to sharp rent increases for assisted tenants, as well as make it easier for lawmakers to make significant reductions in funding for these rental assistance programs over the long term. The outlook for this piece of legislation is a bit uncertain. Since the hearing, there's been some talk of potentially the bill moving to markup in the Financial Services Committee, but that hasn't happened yet, and obviously the House is in recess for now. So certainly keep an eye out for that in September and then after the elections again. Third, there's a bill called the Fostering Stable Housing Opportunities Act of 2017, which is now 2018, H.R. 2069, sponsored by Congressman Mike Turner of Ohio. This is a bill that would impose a new first priority federal preference for foster youth for federal rental assistance of all the major kinds, really. And in order to receive that rental assistance, foster youth would be required to satisfy self-sufficiency requirements. This is a bill that there were hearings on, or one hearing at least, earlier this year, and recently the Financial Services Committee marked it up and reported it out on a straight party line vote. Like the others, the future of this year is a bit uncertain. Given the party line nature of the vote in the Financial Services Committee, it's not clear that they will take up floor time to move that forward later this year. But of course, if they decide to do so, they can certainly do that. So that's something else to keep an eye out for later this year. And then the last one, which is perhaps the most viable of all these, is the Transitional Housing for Recovery and Viable Environments Demonstration Program, or THRIVE Act. This is a bill aimed at addressing the opioid crisis. It would require HUD to set aside 10,000 housing vouchers to provide what's called recovery housing. It's transitional housing for people who have received substance use treatment but are not ready yet to live independently in the community. And this is a bill that, again, was approved by the Financial Services Committee earlier this year and then passed the House as well. That's something else to keep an eye on. There's some talk that the Senate may try to move an opioid package sometime later this month. It's not clear whether something like this would be included in that or not. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so also on my agenda is a quick word about the Housing Choice Voucher Program and where we are in the budget process on this program. As most of you know, the voucher program is the largest federal rental assistance program, assisting about 2.2 million low-income households, half of which are seniors, and most of the rest are working families with kids. I put up a table here that breaks down all the pieces of the voucher account, and I'm just going to talk about these very briefly. There are some pretty significant differences between the House and Senate versions of funding for this account, and I want to flag those. So first of all, on renewals, certainly in any year, a key priority for the HUD budget is to ensure that existing rental assistance is renewed for the coming year, and that includes housing vouchers. The Senate bill includes $400 million more than the House bill to renew housing vouchers. That's the first line there on the table. Under our analysis, the Senate bill funding level will likely be adequate to fully renew housing vouchers next year. The House bill, in contrast, is about $400 million short of full renewal funding, which implies that funding for almost 50,000 housing vouchers that families are currently using would not receive rental assistance renewals next year. So another difference is a significant difference in administrative fee funding for housing authorities. This is the funding that housing authorities use to certify tenant incomes and eligibility, inspect units to ensure they meet federal quality standards, and so on. This funding has been severely short funded in recent years. The House bill provides a small increase over 2018, probably not enough to even cover the losses due to inflation. The Senate bill does a good bit better. It's certainly important to provide more adequate admin fee funding this year as under the Senate bill. So, and then both bills also expand rental assistance as well, though, in differing amounts and for different groups of people. The House bill includes, and looking at the bottom here, roughly $270 million for new so-called mainstream vouchers for non-elderly people with disabilities. That would fund vouchers for about 30,000 people with disabilities, households with disabilities, on our estimate. In addition, the House bill sets aside $50 million for an innovative new mobility demonstration. This would include $30 million in funding for housing agencies to provide enhanced services that help families use vouchers to move to neighborhoods that are safer and have higher quality schools, which there's a lot of research out there now showing that when low-income kids grow up in safe neighborhoods with quality schools, they have a much better chance of succeeding in school and later as adults. So $30 million to provide services to help families move, and $20 million to provide new housing vouchers as well to go with a demonstration. In our view, this is a really important policy initiative that would be great to include in the final bill. The Senate, on the other hand, they set aside $20 million for new family unification program vouchers. That's about 2,000 vouchers for foster youth aging out of foster care, and then a smaller amount than the House, some new mainstream vouchers for non-elderly people with disabilities. Okay, and then my final slide here. So these are the main goals for the voucher program as we see it anyway in the final 2019 budget. Full renewal funding as we see under the Senate bill, expanding vouchers for vulnerable people, and there are options in both the House and Senate bill to meet this goal. Fund a new mobility demonstration that was at $50 million. It was included in the House bill, and provide more adequate administrative fees as well as in the Senate bill.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Doug, for that overview. Now we're going to turn it over to Ellen Lori Hoffman from the National Housing Trust to go into details about project-based rental assistance and housing for special populations.
Great. Thank you so much. We can go on to the next slide. So I'm going to take 10 seconds to talk about my organization, the National Housing Trust, which is a national nonprofit focused on preserving existing rental housing, and we do that through policy, real estate development, and lending. And happy to be a member of the Campaign for Housing and Community Development Funding. We can go on to the next slide. So first, I just want to stop and make sure that everyone in the listening audience understands what project-based rental assistance is before we talk about funding levels. Project-based rental assistance, or PBRA, is a public-private partnership. It provides affordable housing for over 1.2 million low and very low-income households across the country. That includes families, elderly, and disabled households. The average household income is really low. It's $12,000 a year. And over 50% of these households include someone that has a disability or who is elderly. PBRA is a public-private partnership. It's administered by HUD, but it gives the rental assistance directly to private owners of multifamily housing who have a long-term contract by which they agree to keep their units affordable to low and very low-income households. So the residents pay 30% of their income for rent, and the federal government makes up the difference in payments to through their contract with private owners. But we know that, according to HUD, all federal rental assistance, that's project-based and tenant-based, only serves 25% of eligible residents. Okay, next slide, please. So I'm going to kind of breeze through what the differences are between the House and Senate appropriations bills, the advantages and disadvantages and funding levels for both of them. starting with project-based rental assistance. So we're really pleased that both the House and Senate bills do provide $11.7 billion, which we understand from HUD is adequate to renew all PBRA contracts for 12 months. That's what we always strive to achieve, to be sure that no one is displaced from PBRA housing due to inadequate levels of funding. So this funding, we understand, is adequate to cover the rising cost of private market rents and avoids displacing any residents. And it's important to understand that PBRA is tied to market level rents, and that is why it does escalate every year, because as rents rise in the private market, the subsidy levels that are required to keep units affordable goes up. And so, you know, among the many other messages that CHCDF brings to Congress is to make sure that appropriators understand the importance of fully funding those levels in a way that's tied to inflation and tied to market rents. And we understand that $11.7 billion should cover that. We also know that appropriators usually have ongoing conversations with HUD, and sometimes, because as Doug described, it may take a long time before we actually see the final version of a spending bill for HUD. It's possible that those levels could be adjusted, and we encourage the appropriators to continue the dialogue with HUD to make sure that they're keeping track of any changes in the estimated level that's needed. Again, project-based rental assistance contracts allows owners to leverage private debt that they bring in to help finance their property, and as well as equity to permit portfolio refinancing and rehab when properties age and need to be recapitalized. And so the full funding level is critically important, not just to be sure that the properties and the residents are protected, but to make sure that the private sector partners who are invested or that provide lending to support this housing can maintain confidence that the program is going to be fully funded. So that's where we are. I'm going to move on to Section 202, Housing for the Elderly. Again, both the House and Senate bills provide the same level, $678 million in overall funding for Section 202, but there are some differences. The Senate bill provides a little bit more for new construction, $51 million, as opposed to the House bill, $46 million. We're pleased to see funding for new construction, which hasn't been funded in many years. But we believe that more funding is needed for new construction. Approximately $600 million would really be needed to meet the need to build more housing for the elderly, as well as additional funding for expansion of service coordinator funding for about 500 more properties is needed. So while the bills, do provide a decent amount of funding, it's not really enough to meet the current need. Next slide, please. I'm going to turn to Section 811, Housing for Persons with Disabilities. Both the House and Senate bills fully fund the Section 811 PRAC, Project Rental Assistance Contract Renewals, at $154 million, similar to the level funding in the House and Senate bills for Section 202, but there are differences. The House bill provides $390 million for Section 811 mainstream, which are tenant-based vouchers, which is a lot higher than the Senate level of $154 million. So we would prefer to see the House bill funding level accepted in the final analysis. Next slide, please. And just quickly, outside of the HUD budget, there is funding for housing through rural housing appropriations through the USDA bill, and I'm just going to talk for a minute about that. Both the House and Senate bills provide $1.3 billion for the Section 521 Rental Assistance Program. We are not sure, advocates are not sure if that's exactly the right level, because the data that we get from USDA is not, it is hard to tell from the data if that's adequate. So we're trying to get more information. The Senate bill did include an amendment that directs USDA to study the need to preserve rental units in light of an upcoming increase in the number of properties that are going to have maturing mortgages and need to be preserved. And we're hoping that that amendment, as well as just general pressure on USDA, will get us better information on the need for rental assistance and other preservation tools. The House bill provides a little bit more for the rental preservation demonstration, $25 million as opposed to $24, which is a little bit better. And both bills provide $40 million for the Section 515 rental housing direct loans. So as a very quick run through of project-based rental assistance and housing for special populations, but I know we have a lot more to cover. So that's it. Next slide.
Thanks, Ellen.
Yep.
We're going to turn it over to Tess Hembry from the National Association of Housing and Redevelopment Officials to talk about public housing and formula block grants now. So Tess, take it away.
Thank you. Perfect, here we go. Okay, so I'm going to address public housing first, and we'll get a bit into the block grants. Overall, public housing funding in both the Senate and the House bill are pretty decent, all things considered. Both bills rejected the president's attempt to eliminate the capital fund, and they also mostly maintained funding that was increased in the fiscal year 18 omnibus, so that was great to see. The Senate bill is still slightly better than the House bill on both the operating and the capital front. That said, both bills do fall short of the full funding needs of the capital fund and the operating fund. Getting in a little bit deeper to the capital fund, the top chart shows actual funding levels. So there was a huge increase, about 42% increase in capital fund spending in 2018. It was the first time, as you can see, in a long time that we'd seen such a huge increase in funding for the capital fund. So that was really great to see. The Senate adds an additional $25 million in funding to the capital fund over current funding levels. The House maintains funding levels. So it's good to see those maintained, but we do like the slightly higher spending level of the Senate bill. And you can see at the bottom there, the increase in funding still doesn't meet the annual accrual needs of the maintenance public housing. Each year, according to a 2010 study, the capital needs of public housing accrue by $3.4 billion per year. And as you can see at the chart on the top, we have fallen well short of that for several years, pretty much forever. So at this point, when the study was conducted, they estimated that the backlog in deferred maintenance in public housing was about $26 billion. Our estimate's more than double that at this point. We think it's somewhere closer to $56 billion. So that's unfortunate to see. Next slide, please. Moving on to the operating fund. The numbers are pretty good, but again, the Senate bill provides a little bit higher funding than the House. It's about $206 million more. By our estimates, the House PHAs will get about 94% of formula eligibility. With the Senate bill, it's about 98%. And I do want to note the last time the operating fund was fully funded was 2003. So PHAs have been operating off of less than full funding for a very, very long time. Next slide, please. And I recognize those charts were a little bit hard to read. So just to wrap up, the House maintained the current funding level of $2.75 billion for the capital fund, and the Senate increased it by $25 million. One thing to note is the House does create a $30 million competitive grant program for demolition of the most distressed units, and it helps with relocation of residents as well. And again, while we're really happy with this funding level, it's still well short of the $3.4 billion that accrues annually in backlogs of maintenance needs. The operating fund, again, we estimate a proration of about 94% for the House and about 98% for the Senate. Next slide, please. And shifting gears a little bit to the block grant programs, CDBG is maintained at $3.3 billion in both the House and the Senate bill. This was a 10% increase in 2018 from previous fiscal years. We've been really happy to see that level of an increase because the highest funding level it was 2010. And it pretty much leveled out during the austerity years of sequestration. So it's good to see some of that funding restored. It also rejected the president's proposal to eliminate CDBG. And both the House and the Senate bills were written a little bit too late to consider the president's proposal to move CDBG to the Department of Commerce. I don't necessarily know that that's something that appropriators want to take up in appropriations bills, but I suspect that the president may put that in his 2020 proposal. So that's something to watch out for future fiscal years. But again, it's really great to see the House and the Senate maintaining those funding levels for CDBG. That money is desperately needed in communities. Next slide, please. And the home program, we were really happy to see in fiscal year 18, the home program was increased by about 43%, which helped to restore some of the funding that was cut in the fiscal year 2012. Since 2012, it's really leveled out at about $1 billion or less than $1 billion in funding, which is really unfortunate to see because the home program is key funding for the development of affordable housing and gap financing and other federal programs. So the fiscal year 18 funding level of $1.36 billion was maintained by the Senate, but unfortunately the House bill proposes a cut of about $162 million for a total of $1.2 billion. It's unfortunate to see the House taking a step back from that funding increase from fiscal year 18. So I encourage you guys, if you use home in your communities, please, please, please speak out about it and let appropriators and your members of Congress know that this program is incredibly important in communities. That said, we're very happy to see that the House and Senate rejected the president's proposal to eliminate the program altogether. But again, at 43% increase in fiscal year 18, that still is well short of the fiscal year 10 funding level. So we'd like to see that go back up again. That's pretty much all I had to say about public housing and block grant programs.
Great. Thank you so much, Tess. Now we are going to hear about home grants from Steve Berg, the Vice President for Programs and Policy at the National Alliance to End Homelessness.
All right, thanks a lot. You can go ahead and put up the next slide. So I'm going to talk briefly about HUD's McKinney-Vento homeless assistance programs. These are one small program, the ESG program, and the larger program, the Continuum of Care program. Together, they're what communities use to create an emergency response, a crisis response system, so that if people lose their housing, they can be, through outreach programs, they can be found, they can be kept safe, and they can be quickly moved back into housing. These programs have proven very successful in a lot of communities. We have many communities who are reducing the number of people who are living on the streets and in shelters, despite the difficult housing market. And a lot of that is due to this account at HUD and what communities are doing with it. And I know a lot of people listening who are working on homelessness are right in the middle of doing their applications for Continuum of Care funding. And we offer our support and thanks for everybody who works so hard at that. Next slide, please. The status of those programs is this. You can see the last year's funding, the funding you're working at, you're applying your applications for right now, is a little over $2.5 billion. Most of that is to fund existing programs that pay rent for people who were homeless and have now been moved into permanent housing, and continue to have their rent paid by this program. The House and Senate each gave small increases to that program. Both bills provide enough renewal funding to keep existing capacity at its current level, and both include small initiatives to increase the level of capacity. Both the House and Senate included a $50 million initiative for domestic violence to help provide more rapid rehousing for survivors of domestic violence, and also help create systems of coordinated entry so that people who become homeless as a result of domestic violence we can make sure they're being brought into the homeless system and get what they need without necessarily jeopardizing their safety. The House bill includes a new initiative for helping communities deal with unsheltered homelessness, which is a big problem in many communities, especially where rents are going up quickly. The Senate bill, on the other hand, provides another year of the homeless youth demonstration project that we've had the last couple of years to help communities figure out how to do the best possible work they can for homeless youth, which is a population that a lot of communities have but don't necessarily know what the best practices are. And I think these demonstrations that the Congress has been putting out has helped communities with that. At the National Alliance to End Homelessness, we suggested a higher level of funding for this. The $2.8 billion is really what we felt was necessary to both maintain existing capacity and also raise capacity just to the level necessary to deal with the fact that more people are becoming homeless all the time due to rapidly increasing rents, due to increasing evictions around the country. So neither the House or Senate bill, even though they both include new initiatives to increase the size of the program, it's not at the level we've seen yet. So we're going to continue as long as Congress hasn't made a final decision on that. We're going to continue to talk about what the real need is, given the larger housing problems that are putting more people into homelessness all the time. So let me close at that, and we'll have time for questions later.
Great, thank you, Steve. So now that we've gotten an overview of fiscal year 2019 budget, Joe Lindstrom from the National Low Income Housing Coalition is going to give us some advocacy tips and talk about some of the opportunities for increased funding.
Thanks so much, Sonia. I would like to start just by talking about the key fundamental ask right now, which at NLIHC we've been saying since the Senate has passed their bill that the best ask in this moment is to pass a final budget that represents the Senate's version of FY19 funding levels. I'll be quick to note, as you may have seen, that as Ellen presented, that the House bill does provide significantly more funding for Section 811 mainstream funding. And as Doug noted early on, there is $50 million in the House budget that is not in the Senate budget for a new mobility program. But generally, especially when you look at things at like public housing and the home program, the Senate budget bill is the one with the highest funding allocations. And that ultimately is what our ask is. The specific targets in this moment of advocacy is the broadest form of targets, you know, all representatives, all senators. There are moments in the budget process when we're focusing really on the appropriations committees, and there might be moments in the future when we're focusing on representatives or senators who are named to a conferencing committee. But for right now, the key target is really everybody, every representative and every senator. So let's talk now about this unique moment and how people should be advocating during the August recess. Recess, as many of you know, is what members of Congress prefer to refer to as their district work period. It's when they're back in district but still working on your behalf. Both houses of Congress are out until September 4th, as Doug mentioned earlier. And generally, recess periods are a great opportunity for member-level meetings. Oftentimes, if you're visiting D.C., you're more likely to meet with a staff member. When Congress is in recess, it's easier to get a member-level meeting. That's a little bit difficult right now because it's an election year, and members of Congress are busy with their campaign calendars. They're working to get reelected. But I'll get into in the next slide how that's actually a little bit of an opportunity as well. Remember, as members of Congress are back home for this entire month, and frankly, for much of the months that will follow throughout the fall, they're very eager to find as many photo ops as possible. They love meeting with your residents or your members in your neighborhood groups and so forth, and that they like attending your events because it puts them in front of voters where they can talk about how much they believe in your programs and so forth. And it helps you build that relationship that you can then leverage moving on. The bottom of this slide will be a lot of the tips that you'll hear me talking about whenever we do a webinar, which are just, you know, call your representatives and senators, call the DC office or the district office, but most likely build the existing relationships you already have. If there's a district office staff person who knows who you are and you're confident carries your concerns forward, reach out to that person. Right now, if you're calling the DC office, asking for the staffers who work on budget or who work on housing will be the best way to move forward. Always share the information about the impact your federally funded programs have on the community, because it really helps to contextualize what is otherwise just sort of an obscure budget number. So as often as you can share stories and success stories, please do so. And then we really encourage advocates to continue to use Twitter very commonly. We see that members of Congress are very responsive on Twitter and follow their Twitter accounts and Twitter mentions very closely. So we encourage you to do that. So those are some of the common advocacy tips we would provide, but this year's a little bit different. It is an election year, and so there are some additional things to consider. So specific to elections, I want to remind all of you that it is okay for nonprofit 501c3 organizations to engage candidates in elections and to engage in elected officials, as long as this is always done in a nonpartisan way that is not coordinated with a candidate, campaign, or political party. So there are various ways to insert affordable housing and ending homelessness into the ongoing conversation of a campaign. One is to produce candidate questionnaires and actually poll candidates on how they feel about certain issues or what their plan is to end homelessness. Many organizations are producing candidate forums. These are more common for local and statewide races, but they can actually take place for federal representatives as well, sometimes in the form of a debate. We also encourage organizations to produce fact sheets for candidates, informing them of the reality of homelessness and affordable housing in their districts, so that as they discuss the issue, they have the best and most up-to-date information. Obviously, planning a candidate forum is a large and time-intensive process that if you're only thinking about it now, it's probably out of reach. But what you can do is attend town hall meetings that have been planned and organized by other organizations or coalitions. And in participating in the town hall meeting, find a way to the microphone and ask a question that's about housing. Because ultimately, we need to remember that as the debate moves forward for members of Congress, they're talking about a lot of issues that are extremely important. Everything from healthcare to education to immigration to reproductive rights to the environment. But it's crucial that as they campaign for votes, they also consider and also address the needs for housing in their communities. When housing does come up in a debate or in a candidate statement or in a policy proposal on a website, please use your space to respond to how housing and homelessness are being discussed in the debate. You can do this through op-eds, which actually during campaigns are more likely to be published because it's a response to something that's considered newsworthy. You can also do blog posts on your own web space and use your social media to correct the record or to add commentary or perspective to different proposals that are being thrown out during the campaign. NLIHC has been working to get more and more housing organizations involved in elections in a nonpartisan manner. We do this through our effort that we call Our Homes, Our Votes, and you'll notice there's a website right there on the slide. That website was launched recently. It's got some great information on there, including some graphics like the one on this slide that you can apply to what you're doing for electoral engagement in your communities. We're building out that website with new content moving forward, so you can look forward to that. And if you've enjoyed this discussion of candidate engagement so much that you'd really love to do a full hour of exploring how this works, well, I have some good news for you. Because tomorrow, Tuesday, August 7th, 3 p.m. Eastern, we're going to do a webinar that is specific to candidate engagement for housing organizations. Our guest presenters include Senta Leff, who is the executive director of the Minnesota Coalition for the Homeless, and she'll talk about candidate forums, and Eric Huffnagel from Michigan Coalition Against Homelessness will talk about candidate questionnaires and how they publicize candidate responses in Michigan. So please take a look at that webinar. You can join us by RSVPing at the link that's on your slide. And for more information, check out ourhomes-ourvotes.org. And that'll do it for me.
Thanks, Joey. We have some time for questions now.
Thanks. So again, if you have any questions, please type them in the questions or the chat box to the right of your screen. The first question that we have is, do changes in PBRA funding reflect increases in project-based rental assistance through RAD? And what other impact will this bill have on RAD and MTW?
Thanks. This is Ellen. The calculation of what's needed to renew project-based rental assistance every year does include a calculation of what's needed to cover the cost for RAD. And just to remind folks, the Rental Assistance Demonstration, or RAD, is a program that preserves properties that both have our public housing as well as some of the older assisted properties. And it's considered to be cost neutral, so the funding that those properties would have originally been allocated through their original forms of subsidy is transferred over into project-based rental assistance or project-based vouchers, depending on how the conversion process goes. The short answer is yes, the PBRA number, $11.7 billion, does factor in RAD. There's no changes to the RAD program in either bill in terms of changes in the program itself, and there's no authorizing changes. I'm going to turn it over to someone else to answer the MTW question.
Well, one point on MTW. So in the voucher program, what MTWs typically care most about is administrative fees and the voucher renewal funding. Even though MTW agencies are funded under separate agreements, typically block grant agreements, they are subject to renewal funding prorations if Congress fails to provide sufficient renewal funding, and so they have a stake in ensuring that there's adequate renewal funding in the bill.
Thank you. The next question is, are emergency solutions grants the same as rapid rehousing grants?
Yeah, this is Steve Berg. Rapid rehousing is a kind of program, a kind of intervention that provides short-term rental assistance plus help with people to find landlords who will rent to them and help to find jobs so they can pay the rent long term. You can pay for rapid rehousing with the Emergency Solutions Grants program, or you can pay for rapid rehousing with the Continuum of Care program. So the Continuum of Care and ESG are different funding streams, but they both are, rapid rehousing is one of the things that either of those funding streams can pay for.
Thank you. So we have another RAD question. The question is, how can RAD preserve low-income properties, and how does it affect the right to return and the right to remain?
Okay, this is Ellen again. I would say that we could probably do a whole webinar on RAD and how it works. It's a complicated program, and I'm not going to even attempt to try to explain the whole process here, but basically properties that are previously public housing or the older assisted portfolio, which includes rent supplement, RAP programs, and mod rehab. If you're familiar with those older forms of project-based subsidy, either the private owner or the public housing authority can come to HUD and express an interest in participating in RAD. There is a recapitalization process that has gone through, which looks at the capital needs of the properties to use the federal subsidies to leverage private investment to come in and preserve the properties over the long-term period and keep it as affordable. I am not an expert, but my understanding is that the right to remain and I believe the second part of the question was the right to return are preserved, that tenants' rights are fully protected in the RAD program. That is a key element of the program. And perhaps we need to think about a follow-up webinar on RAD to get into more details. I think my email address is up on the website. If folks want to follow up with me specifically on RAD, I'm happy to give them a more detailed answer.
Thank you, Ellen. The next question is, what do the funding bills provide in HCV administration fees?
Well, you can just go back to the slide where I put up the numbers for the House and Senate bills and vouchers. There you go. Oh.
Yeah.
And so the House bill has overall $1.8 billion for admin fees, and the Senate bill, $1.96 billion, both of which are above the 2018 levels. Though obviously the Senate bill includes significantly more resources.
Thank you. Is there a project for low-income renters to advance to home ownership?
Well, we can mention a couple things in that respect. So, some housing agencies do have programs that make use of housing vouchers, which can be used to pay some costs of home ownership. So there's it's called the Section 8 Home Ownership Program. In addition, there's the Family Self-Sufficiency Program, which is now available to voucher, public housing, and project-based Section 8 rental assistance residents, which is really a voluntary program to promote increased employment and earnings and self-sufficiency. And as part of that, people who successfully complete the program build up escrow accounts of funds that they typically in the range of $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 at program completion. And there's some evidence that some families, when they complete the program, use those funds towards a down payment or other costs associated with homeownership.
This is Elaine Weiss from the National Low Income Housing Coalition. I also believe that the home program also allows funds to be used for down payment assistance as well. And there are these smaller niche programs like the Self-Help Home Ownership Program that offers opportunities for home ownership for low-income people.
Next question is, are all landlords of a certain size apartment building required to accept Section 8 vouchers?
No.
Thank you.
I mean, there are some state and local laws
Right.
that require that. In fact, San Diego just passed a new ordinance requiring that, but there's no federal law that requires landlords to take. So.
But our tax credit properties are required to take vouchers, however.
That would be an agreement that an owner would sign as they get an allocation of low-income housing tax credits, but it's not a federal law that, it would be in a separate individual agreement.
This is Joey. For anyone on the webinar wondering if your community does have discrimination protections for Housing Choice Voucher recipients, you can go to the Poverty and Race Research Action Council, and they have a document that they call Appendix B, which lists the various communities and states that have those protections.
Great, thank you everyone. Unfortunately, we are out of time. I just want to thank all of the presenters once again for doing a great job, and thank you for everyone who joined the webinar, and I hope it was informative. Thanks.